Hey, listeners, before we get into today's podcast, I just first of all want to say thank you. This has been 5 years of podcasting for us, and I want to say thank you to those who have been here 5 years listening to us and those who this is your first time listening. It's been a phenomenal journey and a lot of fun, and I can't think of how else I would like to spend the next 5 years other than continuing to podcast and hopefully bring you guys some great shows and great interviews. With that being said, I want to thank today's sponsors, first of which is Pretentious Pickles, our good friends at Pretentious Pickles, located right here in Plymouth, Massachusetts on 190 Water Street, have a huge variety of pickled items for your consumption. There's pickled beets, Brussels sprouts, carrots, mushrooms, cucumbers, you name it, they've put it in a jar and pickled it. They make a phenomenal product, and for the second year in a row have been won Best Gourmet Shop in the South Shore, Massachusetts area. So congratulations to Lorraine and everyone at Pretentious Pickle Company. And if you can't make it to their store, you can stop by www.pretentiouspickle.com and you can place an order online and they'll ship it right to you. If you're into pickles, you should definitely check that out. And our second sponsor today is Hellofresh. Do you feel like you're stuck in a dinner rut? With Hellofresh, you get fresh, pre-measured ingredients with mouth-watering seasonal recipes delivered right to your door. Skip all those trips to the grocery store and count on Hellofresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. You can now enjoy cooking and get dinner on the table in 30 minutes or less with over 25 recipes to choose from each week. There's something for everyone to enjoy. All recipes are designed and tested by professional chefs and nutritional experts to ensure delicious and simplicity. And I was just over there on their website checking out what they have to offer. And I'm telling you, it's making me super hungry. We have a prosciutto wrapped chicken, which I'm such a sucker for prosciutto. Chicken over garlic parm, which looks delicious. And even a beef tenderloin and brown butter veggies. There's a lot to choose from over there. It looks fantastic. And today they're offering our listeners a discount. You can go to the link in our show notes to get $80 off, including free shipping on HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit. Welcome back, Inebri-ites. This is Andy, the Inebri-art podcast, and we're always trying to find something new and interesting to keep you guys informed and something interesting to talk about. And today is definitely a first for the podcast. We have our first medical doctor on the show. We have Suzanne Koven, Dr. Suzanne Koven, who is author of the book Letter to a Young Female Physician. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Andy.
No problem. We were just talking about how you're definitely a little bit outside of what we normally get. But, you are an author, and I think writing in any form takes some sort of creativity. But there's certain things that really struck me about your book. And one is I came from a family with some people in the medical field. So that was one thing. You talk about imposter syndrome, which I feel like everyone in a specific field, or especially like in a creative field, I feel like it's very, very common. So that really caught my attention. And you talk about also basically a woman's role, not a woman's role, but like a woman's experience in a industry that may not typically is more male dominated. Is that
no, I think that'd be accurate. That'd be accurate to say about medicine.
Yeah.
And most other fields.
Yeah, that's very true. That's for sure. So what made you decide to even approach this topic?
As I think is often the case for people writing books, particularly nonfiction books, and particularly sort of personal writing like memoir and essays. The book sort of chose me more than I chose it.
Mm-hmm.
The short version of the story is that well into my medical career, I started writing, taking night courses in writing, sort of revisiting my old English major roots,
Mm-hmm.
kind of as a hobby. The hobby developed into really a sort of a part of my profession. Had a medical column in the Boston Globe for a few years, really about what is this experience of doctoring, which is a very intense and in some ways very strange job. And then after I had published several essays, I realized, I kind of have a book here. And as I laid these essays out, I realized that I really kind of had led a medical life, or a life that could be seen through a medical lens. As a doctor, the daughter of a doctor, as a patient, the child and the parent of patients. I mean, in some ways, we all of us who have bodies have led a medical life. And even my relationship with being a woman, with being a feminist, with being a reader and a writer, could be seen through a medical lens. And so that's how the book evolved. As is, I think, very often the case, the book I ended up writing wasn't quite the book I started out writing. I think that is almost universally the case. But this is where I landed. And having landed there, and now having people read the book and talking to them about it, I feel even more strongly than ever that it was sort of what I was meant to write about, particularly as I speak to young women about it.
Now, from your experience, do you find it more challenging from a female's perspective as far as your colleagues or from the patients? Because, I mean, I've never been in a medical field, but I worked retail at Home Depot, and they would, customers would ask me for advice, and I'd bring them, to the person who knew about flooring or whatever. And if it was a female, mm-hmm. Frequently they would just kind of turn back to me and be like, well, is that right? I'd be like, I don't know. I brought you here because they know. And, mm-hmm. So is it more customer, a patient, or is it more from your colleagues that there's more of a struggle?
What an interesting question. Interesting to me because it's neither. I have actually experienced very little sexism from my patients, here and there, and not all that much sexism from my colleagues as individuals. Mm-hmm. What I have experienced, and what young women in medicine continue to experience, is a kind of structural sexism. There's a pay gap between men and women in practicing medicine. There's harassment. There's a disproportionate responsibility for childcare for mm-hmm. women, in male female couples in medicine and in elsewhere, and also just kind of a culture which says that and this gets into really tricky gendered stereotyped territory, and I'm well aware of the pitfalls of that, but a culture which says or which leads you to say to yourself, gee, these things that I think of as being female traits, mm-hmm. Empathy and ability to communicate and so forth, are important, but they're sort of like a baseline, like anybody can do that.
Right.
Whereas the things that I feel less confident about, those are the things that are somehow more valuable. And I would say that men and women both feel this way. This is part of the imposter syndrome you mentioned, but women are more likely to say, oh, well, yeah, I'm really great at developing rapport with patients, but that's nothing because anybody can do that. Well, anybody can't do that. And if you don't believe that, of course, just ask patients. It's the number one things that patients value. So your question is so interesting to me because it has not been an issue on an individual basis. It's been much more of an issue on a structural and cultural basis.
So it's a more systemic kind of...
Absolutely. And it persists to this day.
That's interesting. Was it that way from the beginning, like even in like medical school?
Yes, absolutely. Although what I'm only realizing now, and you know, when you write about your own life, one of the sort of challenges and joys of that is that, you know, you look back on things that, you know, events that are very familiar to you. I mean, it's your own life. And you say, well, wait a minute, why did that happen? Or why didn't I notice that? Or even question that. And yes, it was very much so. I mean, let me give you an example that I talk about in the book. So I got pregnant as a resident. I was working over 100 hours a week.
Oof.
It did not occur to me or anyone else that it was not a great idea for a pregnant woman to be working those kinds of hours on her feet. Right. And I developed a life-threatening complication of pregnancy. It all worked out okay, but you know, literally made me sick and put my life and my baby's life in danger. Now, I would have called myself a feminist then. You know, I had done, you know, consciousness raising as early as 7th grade. I had, you know, read feminist theory in college, and yet here I was afraid to even think about the possibility of asking for an accommodation because I was afraid that I would be seen as the weak link. Right. That was and still is a very big part of medical culture. It's a little bit like military culture. Don't complain. Don't be the weak link. Don't let down your team. And you know, so that's an example of where there was no individual who was oppressing me or literally making me sick. It was, you know, it was a structural and cultural issue.
Yeah, it's funny. You know, I can't speak to being pregnant, obviously, but you know, I listened to a medical podcast, and it's a female host, and she talks about going through her internship, and I knew of internship. I had no idea. I'm sorry, is internship the right word? No, residency. Sorry. I never had any idea how long those hours are, how difficult that process was, and to do it when you're not in tip-top health. And I mean, I suppose pregnancy is not unhealthy, but you know, it can be challenging, and it's just, that's amazing. And I'm also not surprised that it caused health problems.
Yeah. But I didn't, you know, it's funny, as part of this book tour, in one conversation I had with Meg Waltzer, who's, you know, a novelist who, you know, writes a lot of strong female characters. In her most recent novel, there's a Gloria Steinem character. And she asked me a really interesting question. She said, so, you know, these high achieving women that you were in residency with, did you ever talk about sexism? Did you ever talk about feminism? And I said, amazingly, no, we never talked about it. And it wasn't because it didn't exist, believe me. I mean, as I say, we had all been feminists and studied, you know, feminist theory in college and even in high school. And yet somehow when we were thrust into this very male-dominated environment, that all shut off. We were working really hard, and And we just, I think we're afraid to question anything for fear that it would all fall apart. Now, of course, what I'm describing is sort of pretty out there and pretty exceptional. But I think that I know that there are a lot of women and men too in other fields who experience, experience these kinds of situations where it's not quite right, and yet you're afraid if you begin to question it, it's sort of like pulling a thread, and pretty soon the sweater is gone.
Yeah.
And not to mix metaphors, but the whole thing is sort of cut out from under you. And so in talking to people about the book, it's interesting to me how many women who are young in medicine today and also not in medicine at all say, yeah, I get that. I get that feeling of I can't question this because then just the whole thing will just fall apart.
Yeah. So I have a daughter. She's 17, and we were having a conversation the other day, and she was talking about how she's LGBTQ plus, and how she got kind of people who were like, oh, supportive of other people, but like when it came to her, kind of like, oh, well, not like you should not feel weird, you're a girl or whatever. And she's like, I don't know what I am. And I'm like, that's, you should be happy with who you are. And that's all I want is for her to be happy. So I can totally kind of see through her eyes, kind of that struggle where there is kind of a systemic, maybe not even systemic, more like that's someone else's problem. And when it comes more personal, that people can kind of try to sweep it under the rug or that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that.
Well, I think that there are a lot of people who are non-conforming to the mainstream in some way, depending on what the mainstream is, whether you're a woman, whether you're LGBTQ, whether you're a person of color, that you feel like your best bet is invisibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a conversation, I include this in the book, with one of my Black residency mates. And we had kind of reconnected, and after several years, and I made a comment to him talking about this thing with the pregnancy. And I said, I really am kind of ashamed that I capitulated so much to a system that clearly had very little regard for me.
Mm-hmm.
And his response was so interesting. He said, no, you're wrong. They loved you and they loved me because we made them look good, but we knew how easily we would be discarded if we stepped out of line. And that's why we tried so hard to just be perfect. And being perfect, I think, is a way of being invisible. If I don't complain, if I do my job perfectly, if I don't cause problems for anybody, if I don't embarrass anybody or make anybody uncomfortable, then I will be okay here. Well, that's an exhausting way to live.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. So you do talk about imposter syndrome, and I find it fascinating because it's something I deal with a lot. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience with that?
Sure. Well, first, just to define imposter syndrome a little bit and just give a little background on it. So imposter phenomenon was a term that was coined by a couple of psychologists back in 1978. Now, and it was described as being, let me just Sorry about that.
No worries.
It was described as being particularly prevalent in high achieving women.
Mm-hmm.
And we since know that it very much affects men too. But basically what it is, sorry, what it is, and I have a sign on my door too. What it is it's this feeling you have that no matter what you achieve, whether it's a job or a promotion or perhaps a work of art that you've created, no matter, or an organization you founded or a podcast that you've founded, no matter what you achieve, there's always sort of a little asterisk next to it. And the asterisk says, well, but you got lucky. There wasn't anybody else who was available. You kind of fooled people into thinking you were better than you were. And this is something that is really common. You mentioned in your introduction that this is very common in the arts.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's true. It's also incredibly common in medicine and in many other fields. And I think the conclusion I've come to is that what this is really about is a kind of internalized bias, whether it's sexism, racism, homophobia, ageism, ableism, or even just the way society values, for example, the arts as opposed to more remunerative activities. And there's this kind of drip, drip, drip that you hear in your subconscious for years and years and years that tells you that, you think you're great, you're not that great.
Mm-hmm.
And you believe it. And the way it comes out is in that little asterisk. I mention in the book that though that paper describing imposter phenomenon came out a couple years before I started medical school, I had never heard that term. But clearly, I had the phenomenon because my best friend in medical school and I called ourselves the asterisks. As in, yes, we got into this medical school, asterisk. They probably didn't have too many applicants that year.
Right.
And here's the challenge with imposter syndrome is that what you think is, okay, if I could just get into this school or get this job or win this prize, then that feeling's going to go away. But it doesn't. It gets worse. It throws gas on the fire because the higher you rise, the more of an imposter you feel like you are. So you're an artist, say, and oh gosh, all you want is this prestigious gallery show. Please, 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 that's all I want. And then I'm going to feel like a real artist. Well, then you get it. And you think, yeah, but I had a connection. I knew someone. This other guy deserved it more. Right. So that's never a fix.
And I feel like when you kind of achieve those goals too, it puts, like you said, it adds fuel to the fire because it almost puts more pressure on you to kind of in your mind be at that level. Exactly. If you achieve that gallery show or you get that, appointment to head physician or whatever, then you're suddenly like, oh crap, now I have more responsibility. Now I have to show that I am at that level. And I think that just kind of...
Yes, more responsibility and also more vulnerability because you feel like, and more exposure. Well, okay, now I've got the gallery show. Now I've got the big job. Well, the jig is up. Now everybody's going to see what I knew all along, which is that I was inadequate.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the question is, all right, so if achievement isn't the cure, what's the cure? I think the cure is a little bit of critical thinking and also a little bit of doing what we're doing now, which is talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start with the critical thinking. So let's think about this. Let's say, okay, all right, you're an imposter. What would it look like for you to be not an imposter? Like how good would you have to be? Would you have to be perfect? Well, that's not achievable.
Right.
Would you have to be almost perfect? Like, so what does that look like to not be an imposter? So it really, the whole thing, the logic of the thing kind of breaks down a little bit. In terms of the sharing, I think that's really important because, like all kinds of shame, and imposter syndrome is shame. It's just another name for a very particular kind of shame.
Yeah.
Like all forms of shame, it thrives on isolation. Everybody who has imposter syndrome thinks that either they're the only one who has it, or, well, other people have it, but it's not justified. Like those other artists, they think they're imposters, but they're not imposters.
Right.
Me, really, I'm an imposter. So once you start talking about this stuff and you realize how almost universal this is, then getting back to critical thinking, you have to ask yourself, okay, wait a minute. Statistically speaking, could we all be imposters? That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
I mean, the opposite of being an imposter is what? You know? And I think also there are other roles in our lives where even those of us who suffer badly from imposter syndrome, where we would say, you know, we don't feel like imposters. For example, I never felt like an imposter, even at my worst imposter syndrome. I never felt like an imposter as a parent.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean I was a perfect parent? God, no. God, no. Well, so why wasn't I an imposter as a parent? I mean, that's a really important high stakes job.
Right.
If I wasn't perfect, well, I was doing the best I could, and I kept trying hard, and I kept coming back to it. And I'm human, and sometimes, you know, I suck. And guess what? That's true of doctors and artists too.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring that up. When I had that retail job, I mean, I worked retail since, you know, like I was 16, since I was old enough to work. You know, at one point I ran a team of like 30 people, and I never felt uncomfortable. I never had that in that environment, whether it was because the amount of time I spent in that industry, or there was more concrete, you know, reinforcement of, well, I have years and years of written reviews and, you know, promotions that have reinforced my confidence in that. But then you go outside of that in Inebri-art and the things that I've done, and, you know, someone will ask me for my opinion or call me into a meeting to discuss some things, and I'll just be like, why am I here? Like, yeah, it's so weird.
Well, I actually want to suggest another possibility, though, for why you didn't feel like an imposter in that role. Because, so one question I was asked recently was, well, do you feel like an imposter as a writer? I mean, after all, you know, I came to it pretty late in life. I was in my 40s when I started taking writing classes. In my 50s when I got my MFA, and here I am. I'm in my 60s publishing my book. So somebody asked me, do you feel like an imposter? And I said, you know what? I don't. And I thought, well, okay, why is that? And I think it's because, yes, of course, like all writers, you know, I read the reviews and the ratings and care what people think and so forth. But the generation of the work came very much from within.
Mm-hmm.
It came very much from myself. My identity as a writer was created by me. I wasn't who someone else told me I was in that regard. For you, I wonder if in retail you felt like yourself.
Oh God, please don't say that.
Well,
I hated those jobs.
Well, maybe so, but
Yeah.
the way in which you chose to interact with people, that was probably driven by your own personality and your own values. And maybe you felt like the success you achieved doing so made sense. You were doing what you thought was right, and it worked out, as opposed to sort of being told how to be.
I think I almost want to say it might be a little bit of the exact opposite. When in retail, there's a very hard structure. The Christmas decorations go out on this day, and so okay, there's very little of you. You're just you're taking a corporate plan and executing it, and as long as you execute it the correct way, it's right. Where with something like Inebri-art, there's no corporate plan. It's more just my ideas, and so I think it's more exposing me for me, and personally putting myself out there. So it's and I've there's no secret on this podcast. I've talked about it before, but I've always struggled with self-esteem issues. And so I think when people tend to give me credit for things that I have, were an idea and I executed myself, that I think it tends to be more like, oh, no, that's not deserved. Like, oh, I don't deserve that. So I think that
you feel that's interesting. So you feel that way about the podcast?
I don't. The podcast I started just for fun. So, much like your writing, it was kind of a hobby. It gets a little imposter syndrome-y when we get, downloads in weird, we got downloaded in Oman the other day, which I just learned was a country. Didn't even know where it was. So that's where it starts to feel a little strange, or people will recognize me from the podcast. That's when that kind of kicks in. Mm-hmm. And you're like, I'm just talking to one person. I don't think about anyone else actually hearing it, even though I can go onto the website and see the number of downloads. It's just a number. But like when you interact with someone, and I've had people stop me on the street locally and be like, hey, I'm a big fan. And it's just, it takes me like 45 seconds to even like register what they're saying. Mm-hmm. It's started off just as a fun way to talk to people, and then it kind of, it's very strange. It's a weird experience.
Yeah. Well, the other component of the thinking about it a bit critically is realizing that, if you have X numbers of many people, downloading your podcast time after time, it just doesn't make sense to think that you've fooled them somehow.
Yeah.
In the same way that, people who have been in a job for years and feel like imposters, I mean, at this point, if you have fooled that many people over that much time, I mean, you should get an Academy Award.
Yeah.
I mean, either, what are the possibilities there? These people are very gullible or stupid or have terrible taste or judgment, mm-hmm. Or you're really not fooling them. And I just think it has to do with our very warped expectations of ourselves, because after all, we don't bring these kinds of expectations to other people. How many other people, those of us who have imposter syndrome, how many other people do we think, oh, wow, that person's a fraud, that person's a fraud, that person's a fraud?
Right.
We don't. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, we experience all our faults very viscerally. So if someone says something where like, oh, you're like, I've had people say, I really like your style of interview. It's very comfortable, relaxed, whatever. But then I'm like, yeah, but you didn't see the part where I was looking for my keys for 45 minutes this morning while I was holding my keys. I'm an idiot.
Sure.
But, you know, so like we kind of internalize all those like really silly universal things that everyone does, you know,
Right.
looking for your cell phone when it's in your pocket or whatever.
Sure. And this has been so much exacerbated by, you know, by social media, where everybody presents such edited versions of themselves, curated versions of themselves. And then, of course, who was it who said that, you know, you shouldn't compare your insides to other people's outsides?
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what you're talking about. I mean, I feel the need. I had this yesterday. I did a Zoom facilitated a workshop, and you know, felt the need to explain that even though it looked like I was presiding over this from, you know, my country manse, in fact, I was sitting next to a vase of, you know, fake flowers, and my pile of unfolded laundry was sitting on the bed. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think we all go through that.
Yeah. So kind of to circle back to your book a little bit, what would be your advice for a young woman getting started in the medical industry in some way, shape, or form?
You know, the same as my advice for young women, and men for that matter, in any field, especially ones that are very hierarchical and male dominated, as medicine is, which is to look for women in positions of power and influence. And, you know, because and there are relatively few of them. We've made a lot of progress in our numbers at the entry level. There are more women than men going to medical school right now.
Oh, that's excellent.
Yeah, that is excellent. Unfortunately, they're not getting promoted, and they're not becoming deans, and they're not becoming hospital presidents. There are exceptions to that, but there is a big skew there. So I would say is to try to first of all, try to identify mentors who look like you, if possible, but also to realize that it really is possible. And perhaps I sound, even at my advanced age, very naive saying this, but it really is possible to be successful by being yourself. And if you're in a professional situation in which you feel like you're walking on eggshells all the time, and in which you feel you constantly have to rein yourself in, then it may be time to move on and look for a different one. You know, there are realities, there are bills to pay, but I find all too often that women particularly describe to me, you know, research projects that they're not particularly passionate about, they're afraid to let go of, because, you know, in the same way I was afraid to ask for an accommodation for my pregnancy. Well, if I speak up about this, or if I give that up, or if I express myself in this particular way, then the whole house of cards will fall and I'll be left with nothing. I think that's less true than we think it is.
Yeah, that kind of sounds like sort of wrapped into not dissimilar from the imposter syndrome aspect, where your perception of the situation just isn't accurate.
Yeah, well, but I think we can be forgiven for feeling that way, because I think,
oh, sure, yeah,
I think that we're, you know, this is what we're taught. You know, we are, particularly women, are taught to make things comfortable for other people, even when we are uncomfortable ourselves. You know, I talk in the book quite a bit about my own mother, and you know, she was very much a woman of her generation, until she decided to stop being a housewife and go to law school when she was in her 40s. And that was in about 1970, kind of at the dawn of the second wave women's movement. But, one thing I say about her is that she very much saw it as her job to make things nice for everybody else.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of us women, particularly, we don't do it in the way my mother did, and, arranging the pretty platters and having the hair done just so, when the husband came home, that was a generational thing. But I think in the workplace, women often feel like it is our job to make sure that everything is very placid and comfortable for everyone else, even at the expense of our own voice.
Yeah, and it's. I try to be very cognizant of other people's experiences, and so I see things, and it's the one that just jumps out in my mind is I've seen many women complain about being told to smile more, or why aren't you smiling?
Absolutely, on the street all the time.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, like, it never occurred to me that was sexist or insulting in any way. And I can't think of a time that I said that to anybody, but it's just one of those, even those simplest things where it's like, well, you should be doing what I want you to do.
That's right. Well, and even more specifically, you should be doing the thing that makes me feel more comfortable.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's tough, and I wish people could see that from the other standpoint, because if as a guy, if someone kept telling you to smile, you'd probably have some choice words for them and move on with your day and be like, what's wrong with that person? But then it's just a really strange dynamic, and it's interesting. The older I get, the more that I see of it, and kind of like, oh man, I didn't realize that was problematic, it's so I think books like yours are really important to kind of to bring awareness and light to it. Do you feel that there are a lot of men that read your book?
Yes, and that delights me. For a number of reasons. I mean, there are men who read it because they're in medicine, and there's a lot of what I talk about medical training and practice, interactions with patients, balancing being a human being with being a doctor, that are, certainly relevant to men in medicine. But a lot of men have read it who aren't in medicine, because really what the book is about is, how do you figure out how to be a person? How did I figure out how to be a person? How do you figure out, who you are? And so in that way, I hope it transcends medicine, and I hope it transcends gender.
I think there's a lot to be said about that. And I always find that when I try to work at someone else's expectations, I struggle. But if I work just as Andy, just being myself, doing, working hard and just doing what I think is best, I tend to achieve far more and, gain more friends and, have more, influence. And it just seems that when you're more genuine, people respond to that far better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, they respond to it better, and it also invites them to be more genuine. But then there's the other thing, which is that if you are genuinely yourself and people aren't responsive to that, they're not your people. So,
True.
So it's okay.
Yeah.
You don't have to be everybody's people.
Yeah, I don't have to be everybody's friend, right?
You don't have to.
So where can people go to find your book, A Letter to a Young Female Physician?
Well, it's sold in every place books are sold. Of course, I would prefer that you buy it from your favorite indie bookstore. If you would like a personalized copy for yourself or as a gift, concordbookshop.com is selling those. I will stroll over there and write whatever message you would like me to write, and they will mail it to you. But it's sold everywhere books are sold, and you can get all those links at my website, which is SuzanneKoven.com.
Are there Kindle versions or audiobook versions available?
Yes, there's a Kindle ebook version, and the audio version, which I've just recorded, will come out on Audible and everywhere else, I believe, on September 7th.
You did it yourself? How was that experience? I feel like that'd be
strange.
It
was really hard.
Yeah.
I'm not a singer, and what I realized is that there's a kind of breath control involved in reading page after page after page that the average person doesn't possess. I had a wonderful sound engineer who coached me through it, and it was actually quite a wonderful experience.
Oh, that's very cool. Do you have plans for another book anytime soon?
Absolutely. That's I tell people it's kind of like having a baby. While you're doing it, you think no sane person would ever do it again. and then after you do it, you say, yeah, that wasn't so bad. I could do that again. I guess that's how the human race gets perpetuated. I'm not sure there's a biological reason why one feels the urge to write another book, but most people who write one want to write another. I think, all kidding aside, I think there's a reason for that, which is that there's this, when you write a book or, create any kind of art, there's this sort of deep sense of intimacy and truth-telling. Mm-hmm. And you want to have that experience again. So yeah, I'm giving myself the summer to kind of refill the well, and in the fall I'll be working on another book.
Nice, that's exciting. Well, I just want to say thank you for taking the time. I just flew by because it was really fascinating, and definitely outside our normal guests. But I thought it was great.
Well, it's wonderful to talk to you, Andy. You are not a fraud.
I'm not a fraud. Oh, thanks.
Absolutely.
No, thank you so much. And when you're done your new book and you're ready to promote that, please come back. I'd love to talk more.
I'd love that too.
That'd be fantastic. So thank you again. And so our listeners, make sure you go out and check A Letter to a Young Female Physician, and we'll catch you guys again next week. Thanks for listening to today's podcast. You can find us on all social medias at Inebri-art or on Instagram at Inebri-art6. You can email us at Inebri-art@yahoo.com. And make sure you listen to the other podcasts on the Inebri-art Podcast Network, including Bar Talk, Old Colony Cast, Retro Redoctopus, America's Hometown Horror Podcast, and our newest one, Theme Park Legends, a podcast about working at theme parks. What else? And we'll catch you again next time.